You are now boarding CRD San Diego, California. The last word out of your mouth from here on out will be sir. Do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
I think so. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
I tell you to get off this bus. You're going to get off this bus without even running, pushing, or shoving. Get on my yellow footprints from front to rear, right and left. You understand that?
Yes, sir.
Get off the bus right now.
Go, tighten it up.
Historian Henry Brooks Adams once said, "They know enough who know how to learn." These Marine Corps recruits are counting on the truth in that statement to get them through the toughest 3 months of their lives. They must learn how to survive in a harsh new environment in which the smallest details of their behavior are scrutinized. They will have to change lifelong habits and learn new skills. In the Marine Corps, as in life, an individual's ability to learn can make the difference between success and failure. But how do we learn? What is involved in the learning process? Humans are born helpless. But dependence on others to provide for our basic needs doesn't last long. Perhaps because we come equipped to learn. But what is learning? The common answer is the acquisition of knowledge. To psychologists, however, learning has a much broader meaning.
Psychologists define learning as a relatively permanent change in behavior or mental processes due to experience. And what really the essence of this topic are those last 3 words, due to experience. Because different experiences, different patterns of experiences lead to changes in behavior or mental processes.
Whether it's a child wrestling with a spoon for the first time, or a recruit in basic training, learning is crucial to the survival of our species. It is learning that enables us to adapt to our ever-changing environment. As we learn, we develop behaviors that help us to operate more effectively in our surroundings. And hopefully, we also learn to eliminate behaviors that hold us back. While some of the learning we do is intentional, such as taking on a new skill, much of it is not.
When my daughter was less than a year old, with infants, of course, you have a whole series of vaccinations you have to do. And the very first time that we went in for routine vaccination, everything was hunky-dory with our daughter, right up until the time that Paula, the nurse, who was wearing a white uniform, gave her the vaccination. Now, Laura just, screamed bloody murder. I mean, it hurt, it scared her, everything else, and she was, trying to get away. 3 months later, we had to go back for another vaccination. And my daughter did fine. We went to the pediatrician's office, and we were in the examining room, and she was just happy, happy as a clam, and until, of course, Paula, the nurse, came in wearing this white uniform, and Laura screamed bloody murder. Now, Laura had become conditioned. She had associated this white uniform, okay, with getting the pain of the injection, the vaccination.
What happened with little Laura is an example of classical conditioning, one of the most basic forms of learning. It describes how certain stimuli can automatically trigger a reflexive response. Humans have many reflexes. We shiver when we are chilly. We jump at a loud noise. Our heart pounds with fear when we feel threatened. These reflexive responses are involuntary, automatically triggered by a cold draft, the loud noise, or the growling dog. But we often have reflexive responses to stimuli that wouldn't ordinarily trigger that response, such as a nurse's uniform triggering fear in a child. Classical conditioning describes how this comes about.
Classical conditioning was initially discovered and studied by Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. And his goal in his early career was to study the digestive process. And the strategy that he adopted was to study the behavioral reactions, the physiological reactions that occurred as something entered the mouth. His strategy was thwarted very early on when he found that the dogs he was studying became, in his words, psychics. He would take a dog and he'd food deprive it, and he'd put it on a little stand. And what he'd do is he'd blow some meat powder into the dog's mouth and study the salivary reflex. And after a couple of days of this procedure, he found that the dog, when it entered the stand, would begin salivating in anticipation of being fed. And at that point, his experiment was ruined because he couldn't study the reaction to the food. The dog was salivating as a psychic, predicting that he was going to get food.
After some initial frustration, Pavlov soon realized the importance of the connection he had observed. His very presence seemed to trigger an automatic response in the dogs, the salivary reflex. Pavlov wondered if the conditioning he had observed could be repeated with another, seemingly unrelated stimulus.
The story goes that Pavlov's laboratory actually lived above his laboratory. At that point, he ran upstairs and stole a metronome off of his wife's piano and brought it down into the laboratory. And as an experiment, what he'd do is he'd turn this metronome on for a minute or two, and then he'd deliver the food to the dog's mouth. And after several pairings of this metronome, which didn't elicit any salivation, wasn't a food object for the dog, pairings of that with the delivery of food to the animal, the dog began salivating to the metronome.
Before the dogs were conditioned, the unconditioned stimulus of food triggered an unconditioned response, that is, the salivary reflex. In other words, Pavlov's dogs did not have to learn to salivate when food was placed in their mouths. And under normal circumstances, they wouldn't salivate at all to the sound of a metronome. The metronome is a neutral stimulus. But when the neutral stimulus, the metronome, was repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the food, the dogs began to salivate at the sound of the metronome alone. This neutral stimulus became a conditioned stimulus, and the salivary reflex became a conditioned response. There are many examples of classical conditioning in humans. One of the earliest experiments was conducted by psychologist John Watson, who conditioned a baby to fear a white rat by pairing the rat with a loud noise. Eventually, little Albert came to fear other furry white objects, including rabbits, cotton, and even Watson wearing a Santa Claus beard.
You are now members of Platoon 1093, Series 1093, Company B, 1st Recruit Training Battalion. I will now introduce to you the drill instructors responsible to me for your training. Senior drill instructor, take charge of these recruits and train them to become United States Marines.
Aye, sir. Again, my name is Gunnery Sergeant McWilliams, and I am your senior drill instructor. I am assisted in my duties by Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Villa and Drill Instructor Staff Sergeant Matt. Our mission is to train each one of you to become a United States Marine. A Marine is
Classical conditioning is a key strategy in turning raw recruits into Marines.
The purpose of recruit training is not to train a Marine for combat, but to train him to be a basically trained Marine. If I am breaking down a misconception, where a Marine will be trained for further on for combat is when he leaves here and he goes on to specialized schools. What we're doing, though, here is preparing him for the discipline that he's going to confront at these specialized schools. How do we work the discipline in? 1, instant and willing obedience to orders. How are we going to do that?
The first step in moving a group of independent-minded teenagers toward instant and willing obedience to orders is to trigger the reflexive response of fear.
You will always be at the position of attention, you understand me?
Yes, sir!
Wait, do you understand me?
Yes, sir!
You will always be at the position of attention! Position of attention!
Most people reflexively respond to yelling with fear. So the drill instructors yell at the recruits. In this case, yelling is an unconditioned stimulus that elicits the unconditioned reflex of fear.
Okay, aye, sir. Aye, sir. Aye, sir. Let me tell you something right now. Who is going to take you seriously if you don't talk with some conviction? No, shut up. I didn't ask for an answer.
First, he's going to use a voice. Now, some of the way we get our responses, recruits don't like the shouting voice.
This yelling is paired with the neutral stimulus of the drill instructor's hat, the distinctive campaign cover.
We call it cover identification. For us, it's a visual identification that they're going to sit there and focus on, because they know this cover represents the Marine drill instructor.
Soon, the cover alone triggers a fear response, whether or not the drill instructor is yelling. The neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned reflex of fear is now a conditioned response.
The recruits know that this represents a drill instructor. If I take this off, they might see me in a different light for a chance. When I put it back on, the recruits will respond and turn differently to me.
During the 3 decades Pavlov studied classical conditioning, he noticed 2 important variations called stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination.
Stimulus generalization is where you respond not only to the original conditioned stimulus, but other similar conditioned stimuli. So the way Pavlov did this with dogs, he could condition a dog to salivate to a tone, and then he could condition the dog to salivate to a higher pitched tone or a lower pitched tone, and the dog would salivate regardless of whether the tone was high pitched or low pitched.
Little Albert is a perfect example of stimulus generalization. While he was conditioned to fear a white rat, his fear response generalized to include other white furry things. Remember, even Santa's beard triggered this response.
Stimulus discrimination is basically just the opposite, where you respond to the original conditioned stimulus, but not other similar conditioned stimuli. So if we stay with the same example, Pavlov could condition the dog to salivate only to, we'll say, a medium-pitched tone, but not to a high-pitched or a low-pitched tone. The dog is discriminating between those similar stimuli.
Another example of stimulus discrimination would be if a Marine encountered a national park ranger who wears a hat similar to his drill instructor. Would he respond with the same fear? Probably not. The Marine would make a distinction between the 2 hats and the persons wearing them and respond appropriately. He is able to discriminate between the 2 stimuli.
You understand me? Yes, sir! Go help someone! Go! Yes, sir!
As we've seen, classical conditioning explains how we learn involuntary reflexive responses to stimuli that wouldn't ordinarily trigger that response.
You're moving too slow!